what I want to talk about today is the title that I've given this is the Wellbeing Revolution and the Future of Work. But I want to do something that's maybe a little bit less thought about and to think a little bit more critically about the concept of the future. So hopefully this gives, before I get to a conversation around experience, hopefully this gives people an opportunity to think a little bigger than thinking just necessarily about the problems of the present or even the problems that, that we faced before we hit this present. So let's get started and see where we wind up. And I'm also really interested to hear from you, Al, and follow the chat and really get that sense of the discussion as well. So when people think about the future, they think about a lot of things, but often they think about more. And the painting I have here is one of the Italian futurists of the 1930s or 1920s, actually. And think about more. So this idea of abundance, more technology, more automation, more, all sorts of stuff. But paradoxically, we also think about less. We think about less human interaction. We think about less jobs, and we think about less resources. And just quickly, I want to tell a story. So on the image that you're seeing is from Horton Hardart's Automat, which opened in Times Square, New York in sort of early 1910s. And what you see when you look at the Automat was these gleaming rows of stainless steel with, amazing products sitting behind each one of those. You put a nickel in and you take your plate of pie, you take your plate, your steak dinner or your sandwich or whatever. It was an automated diner that has been said to have had a lot of influence on what we now see as fast food takeaway, of also convenience stores. But of course, the automats weren't actually automated at all. Behind that gleaming row that you could see was a whole host of kitchen workers just hidden from view, invisible hands doing invisible tasks. So automation has always had, and the history of the future and technology has always had this double hand that, yes, on the one hand, for the most privileged and for many of us, it has meant that we get more automation, we have more opportunity, we have better access to things, but there is always this undercurrent. There is always others who are excluded from whatever future we pursue. And it's really important that as we start to frame up this idea around a future of work in this present, as we always have had to, that we think about how the effects of the future, and I know, Al, that you spoke about this with Juliet, the effects are not evenly distributed. The whole idea around things like human-centered design thinking, these sorts of well-being revolutionary ideas is not actually all that new. In the 50s, people, and even much before, but in the 50s, people like Buckminster Fuller were bringing together cross-disciplinary teams with a view to how we might think about the future and how we might imagine it differently. Fuller's geodesic domes and ideas like that were really about how we could imagine the way that cities and spaces and human spaces go together differently, how they pick up on different ideas around nature and our interaction with nature, our ways of connecting together, our sense of community. So these things, we're in a long line of these new initiatives. And let's be honest, cities aren't made up of Fuller's geodesic domes, but these ideas have been incorporated again and again and again. So when we come to these more modern ideas of well-being and incorporating well-being into, into work, we're really, tapping into a long lineage of how those things have looked and how they've been imagined over a very long period of time. What I'd love people to do in the chat, and I hope I get the timing right, so we've got some time to maybe go through some of these. This is maybe a bit of a difficult one to think through as a question, but what is your first memory of thinking about the future? When was the first time you remember actively thinking about the future? For me, reflecting on this question as I wrote it, I was thinking about the fact that growing up, I always wanted to be a pilot. But I just assumed, as a 6-7-year-old who'd just seen Star Wars and all of those sorts of films, I assumed that I would be a space pilot. So one of my first memories of thinking about the future was just that, yeah, I was going to do a job that was pretty recognizable. Funnily enough, I'd never been on a plane at that point, but I just imagined that the sort of thing that I would fly as a pilot would not be what was currently in the sky. It would be far more advanced. We'd be living the Star Wars, as it were. So I'd love it if people could just have a think whilst they're listening through the rest of this talk. What was your first memory of thinking about the future? Was it optimistic or pessimistic? What was it attached to? What type of future did you imagine, and what did you imagine your place to be within it? One of the key problems that we have when we think about the future of work, and one of the key problems that I suppose we have, and we have had since effectively since the 80s, is, but certainly much before, is the march of kind of industrialization has meant that traditional economies focus on how we come up with business solutions to solve business problems. And we can see this across pretty much all industries. Most of Silicon Valley is built on it. This idea that what we're trying to do is to come up with, yeah, maybe a human problem, but many of the most profitable companies are actually solving business problems. They're framed up around this idea of making money for organizations who make money. And we are positioned as consumers and workers within that arrangement. And that's a particular kind of tension in the sense that we might be contributing in to solving the business problems, but ultimately then we are just consuming things on the other side. And it creates a very one-to-one relationship, which I would argue means that we devalue certain activities. So what I would suggest is, and certainly at Nilo, when we think about the future of work, we think that an expanded view of the economy would focus on the ways, not that business solutions solve business problems, but on the ways that we create value for each other in everything we do. And I've got here just some random symbols that I've pulled together from keynotes, so don't attach too much meaning to any of them. But I've tried to be at least a little bit purposeful here that, traditionally, in traditional economies, we think of things like nature as a resource that we can exploit. We don't necessarily think of it as something that creates value innately in its own way, but more ecological models of thinking about the future do actually understand the value, the inherent value of those spaces. Similarly, we look at something like child rearing and childcare as effectively a cost, where in an expanded view of the economy, we would understand what caring contributes to communities and therefore what caring contributes to our lives. The same with art. We have an economy of art where art is considered valuable or not valuable in a commercial sense, but in an expanded view of the economy, we would see the practice of doing art in all of its forms, whether it be music or whether it be the traditional arts or whether it be more experimental modern arts. We would see that the actual doing and the practice of that contributes something, contributes value and builds value. So rather than focusing necessarily on the dollar value and share return of solving business problems to business or business solutions to business problems, we can think about the way that all of these things can work in concert to create value for all of us in a community. And I would argue that as we're coming to consider well-being in the future of work and we're trying to smush those two concepts together, it's really critical that we start to think in much more expanded ways, because it allows us to potentially put society together differently. Juliet was talking, I think, really eloquently about the idea of inequity in terms of having meeting. I'm currently sitting in my study, which is lovely. I know that many of the people I interact with don't have that option, including our managing partner has just had another baby, which is fantastic, but it means that his study has turned into the baby's room. So now he's having meetings, essentially kind of trying to find the one quiet spot in the house. And these things are likely to continue until we really start to think more expansively around what spaces are for. One of the most critical things in this work from home transition, when it comes to COVID and how we've had to respond to that, is we've actually spent as a society 60, 70 years building houses that were never meant for the function that they now serve. They were really never meant to be the space where we lived 100% of our lives. One of my favorite stories in relation to that is in Australia, when the first lockdown happened, there was panic buying, as people would well know. It was reported in the news. I was chatting away to a friend who was saying part of the reason for the panic buying was a shift in consumer behavior. But another reason that the shelves were bare in the supermarkets was because supermarkets have actually never had to supply 100% of our food. That's not their function. They supply in Australia around 60% of our food, and 40% is consumed out of home. So really, our systems have never been set up for us to go to one store for all of our needs and live within four walls. It has always been set up for us to have this as part of our life and then move on to other spaces. So if we're going to consider more remote working and working from home and things like that, we actually need to rethink the way that we put our cities together and rethink the way we construct value together to be able to fully leverage that and actually get beyond just thinking people need bigger houses with another room that has a study where they can take quiet meetings. That's a bit of a stopgap solution to a much larger problem. The argument that I want to make, and perhaps the one thing I want you to take away from this talk today, is that the future is not just a game of chess or a road that we as individuals or as communities sit and consider the next move as though it is sort of linear, as though it makes sense and is just born out in front of us. The future actually competes, and it competes for time, attention, and resources. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time illustrating what I mean by that. I've just framed up four types of solutions here, but the way that I like to conceive of the future and the way I like to explain this is to say the future isn't a game of chess. It's like a game of Hungry Hungry Hippos. I hope that people get that reference. It was a game that I grew up playing. So anyway, if not, look it up. The future is a game of Hungry Hungry Hippos, and different types of solutions compete for time, attention, and resources. So I've picked four here, but there's no doubt many, many more that we could think about. So I've said technological solutions, human solutions, bureaucratic policy solutions, and ecological solutions. I'm going to go through each of them just to make it a little bit clearer. So for example, a bureaucratic or policy solution might be creating a policy within a company or an organization or at a government level that encourages fathers to take parental leave. Now that is a great policy. It's a net positive thing, but it actually won't necessarily succeed unless it's able to mobilize a whole heap of other resources that aren't just about creating an environment where fathers can put in a form and take parental leave. That's solving one part of the problem, but ultimately it needs to actually take a whole heap of the others. I'll keep moving and then I'll explain how these things compete a little bit more. Another one on the human solution side might be something like Are You OK Day here in Australia. I'm not sure if that's global, or a similar initiative around mental health, which aims to get people to talk about things that they've previously found difficult, like mental health. Great initiative, but it competes for time, attention, and resources with a whole heap of other views of the future that we want to construct. So it actually competes for attention from policy solutions that then have to line up with a kind of human solution that wants people to talk about mental health, with a policy environment that actually does something about it, with an ecological environment that helps enable positive mental health, with technological solutions that help to define and diagnose poor and intervene in poor mental health. So all of these solutions compete with each other. Technological solutions might be something like an app that schedules workers to meet customer demand. Now that might improve customer experience, which is a big part of what we do at Nilo, but that competes with things like initiatives that try to get people to talk about mental health when you're getting them to, when you're atomizing their work and you've got workers branded as not employees. Those things compete with each other. And then in terms of ecological solutions, we have a whole heap of government initiatives, 2 decades of government initiatives that have aimed to, create 15-minute cities or encourage sort of local communities within bigger cities. But these things compete with an office environment that brings people into uses central corridors to bring people into workplaces in densely packed CBDs and then abandons them at night time. So the government can be, a government policy or a bureaucratic solution can be aiming in one way, but there might be all of these other competing tensions that mean that it doesn't necessarily achieve its aims. Like I said, it's a game of hungry, hungry hippos, and our time, attention, and resources are the little balls. No one solution can actually take them all, but they're all fighting for them. So my argument is that when we're designing for the future of work as people within the people and analytics space, and more broadly in what the work that we do in the consulting space, but also for organizations more generally, we need to think about how different kinds of solutions come together to solve complex problems, but also how different types of solutions might be getting in the way of each other. And it's critical when we start to map these things out that we actually think about how a particular solution might need the support of other types of or other areas to actually succeed. It's not enough to just say we want positive mental health, we're going to solve the human problem, without understanding that the technical problems and the bureaucratic problems might be getting in its way, just to use the examples I've got on the screen. I want to tell another quick story about Bodega, which was the most voted the most hated startup of 2017. And this is just one of those cases where what we've got is a business solution solving a business, or a business opportunity being solving a business problem, i.e., delivery of convenience goods, but doing it in a way that doesn't necessarily take account of the complexity of the environment that it's trying to sell into. So Bodega, which for those of you who live outside of New York City may not know that a bodega is essentially the corner store in New York City. And two Silicon Valley founders came up with this idea to basically do vending machines, very, very fancy looking. You're seeing the corner of one there, fancy looking vending machines that they would put in buildings to make it easier for people to get convenience items. Now, it was seen as being culturally insensitive. It was seen as being the absolute epitome of gentrification, that it was trying to get rid of, what are really quite often mum and pop and very much kind of often in New York City, first generation immigrant business opportunities, the corner store. I was trying to sort of gentrify that and take that away. So it was seen as very, very culturally insensitive. And one of the quotes that I love, actually from one of Juliet's colleagues, is we're pretty rapidly approaching the limit of problems that rich white guys in Silicon Valley have that can be solved with technology. I think that's a really kind of true thought, that the answer in terms of the future of work isn't just to throw more technology at problems. It's actually to step back and think about the human problem behind the business problem, and more than that, to think about how do we create value together? How do we come together to create value together, rather than in the Silicon Valley mindset, how do we leverage human behavior to create, to extract value, which is what has sort of been, I suppose, the constant of companies like Facebook and what they've been accused of. So I come back to sort of two questions, and then I just want to pivot quickly to finish and hopefully open up some conversation. What are the human problems that we can solve for? What I would argue is that, sorry, I framed that poorly. What I would argue is that we need to focus on, as people who are tasked with improving employee experience and improving the experience of work more generally, we need to focus on what are the human problems that we can solve for, rather than the business problems we can solve humans for. There's a lot of technology at market. One of the examples that immediately springs to mind is around Amazon using cameras and robots to track the movements of their staff, and not really allowing things like bathroom breaks, and having insane productivity targets, those sorts of things. Those are all solutions that aim to solve humans, to improve efficiencies, to improve those sorts of things. It's really the business of very traditional kind of top-down, really negative, I suppose I want to say, consulting models of the sort of 80s and 90s that were really about reducing headcount, increasing throughput, those sorts of things. I would argue that in the future of work, we have an opportunity to flip the script on that and to think about the human problems we can solve for, rather than the business problems we can solve humans for. And if anybody is interested in the image that I've got there, that's Copenhagen, which is a Björk Ingels who created. It's a ski ramp that actually sits on top of a power station. And the argument is that the power station is so clean that people can actually use it as a recreational park. So I just want to quickly pivot to talk a tiny bit about what we do at Nilo, and how we sort of attack some of the concepts that I've talked about thus far. So we see customer experience and employee experience as one whole system that can't be separated. They come together in absolutely intrinsic ways, and to pull them apart is to do a disservice to either. So we would argue that if you improve the experience of your people, you'll have more motivated, aligned, and engaged employees. And because of that, the experience of your customers will improve. And there's a lot of evidence behind that. And on the same side, if you improve the way that people engage and understand their customers through human-centered design principles and things like that, then your employees are much more proud of their work and tend to be more engaged and see themselves as part of something bigger. That's the only part of the sales pitch I'm going to give. I just wanted to give you a context of how we come to what we do. We do this across two axes. First, we think about value in terms of alignment. So this is what makes businesses remarkable. It's connected to vision, to values, to purpose. These ideas that actually mobilize and motivate a business and mobilize and motivate people. And they tend to be qualifiable, tends to be statements that we can actually extract from a business, tend to be the beliefs and behaviors that operate within a business. And then on the other axes, we have those things that are more impactful, those things that actually create impact within a business and create impact for employees and create impact for customers. And we argue that we can map these things. We can actually see how they move over time. We can see how they cluster, how these touch points within a business actually cluster for specific employees, for specific customer groups, so on and so forth. So these things together create value and they create purpose. They tend to be quantifiable and qualifiable, but more importantly, they're mappable, which means that we can actually set a direction, we can set a roadmap, we can actually think about the types of solutions that we're going to use to solve sticky problems within business, and then we can set about doing it. So what we're always aiming to do is to create more impactful and more aligned experiences for a business and give more customers and more employees access to those. Now, I've got a couple minutes left, but I actually want to finish early because hopefully we can have a bit of a conversation about this. My sort of finishing point is the real future of work is about purpose and how we create value for one another. We've spent enough time now creating value for business as a general abstract context. There's actually an opportunity with new modes of working and with all of the sorts of new solutions that we can come up with to solve complex problems to be focusing on purpose and how we create value for one another, how we can bring more people into this expanded idea of an economy. So I suppose the way to flip the question that I asked earlier is, standing on this precipice as we are, what do you want your first memory of building that future to be? Thank you.
Shane, that was moving. It was fantastic. It was beautiful. I mean, your narrative is inspiring. So thank you for sharing. And I do want to pick up on the last point because there's so much that we could talk about and time is limited. But I really am interested in the how, because everything that you shared, I was like, yes, yes, yes. And taking an organization specifically from where it is now to where it needs to be to meet the needs that you are describing and achieve the future that is more humanistic and that has, frankly, more authentic, real language to it. What's the first step? And let me just put an idea there. I have found that organizations have been reluctant to actually create the space to explore what's possible and in turn devise ways to achieve that vision. And it's like consulting 101, but really getting a diverse group in a room to explore. I mean, is that the way you approach your work? What would you advise for an organization, a leader specifically, to say, okay, we need to shift. This is, step 1, 2, or 3. What do you got? What comes to mind?
I think one of the biggest limitations. I don't want to be a smaller, scrappier consultancy that slags on the bigger, more traditional consultancies, because I don't think that's a fair representation of either position. But I think one of the problems of that more traditional model is the idea that we have to focus on whole of business transformation, and that raises the stakes massively. So if we begin with the view that any solution that we come up with has to be rolled out across an entire organization, and we have to immediately have that rollout plan, then what we do is we automatically, I don't know how much of a musician you are, but we automatically sort of compress the signal. We automatically limit what it can possibly be. And we end up with more and more bureaucratic solutions because people will tend to think about all of the possible ways that something could go wrong. So one
Mm.
example that I like to give is actually a Google example. They found that they were having a lot, this is many years ago, and I'm sorry I don't have the exact details, but they found they were having a lot of issues when it came to their payment reconciliation process, so their expense accounts and things like that, because people were putting in expense receipts and all sorts of stuff like that. And they effectively flipped the script. So they gave everybody, corporate cards, and gave people guidelines on what was okay and what was not okay, and then incorporated an element of trust and just said, here's the card, go and do the right thing, rather than thinking initially of all the ways that that would be exploited and that would be taken advantage of. And what they found was that discrepancies went down massively, because introducing that element of trust across the business actually gave people an opportunity to feel valued, gave people an opportunity to feel that they were actually they were being encouraged to do the right thing rather than policed out of doing the wrong thing. Sorry,
Mm.
excuse me. So that's sort of one example of, we come from this idea that we need to control the behavior of individuals. And what we find is often if we flip that script and actually value individuals, they'll rise to the occasion. The other one, and
Interesting.
especially I think when it comes to um, bringing more diversity of thought, is that issue I sort of started on, which was, if you start from the position that you need to be able to roll out every solution across an entire organization, you don't get very far. But if you create
Mhm.
pockets that have permission to fail with ideas, then you potentially come up with much more scalable innovation. It just may not
Mm.
necessarily, you may not necessarily know where it's going at first. So I think the first place for many businesses to start is to find a pocket where they feel that, and this is one, I suppose, one of the principles of human-centered design and design thinking, find a pocket for innovation and focus on that and grow that, and even find multiple pockets of innovation and grow those. They don't all have to look the same. An organization doesn't all have to look the same. Everyone just needs to know how they're producing value overall together, how they're coming together to produce value. And
Yeah.
that doesn't necessarily look like having one mission statement that you cut into vinyl and stick up on the wall behind people. It means actually having a lived set of values and a lived vision that drives the behaviors and activities within the business and within the people in the business.
Yeah. Well, you're selling me. So thank you for, again, putting together such a, I mean, your passion comes through, even though you have a very graceful delivery. You can feel the belief behind it. And that's very inspiring. So Shane, thank you for doing what you do. And thank you for sharing with us today. And you be well, and look forward to following up with you very soon. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Al. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to everyone, and I hope everyone's well out there.